There is a story that gets told about the Islamic world. Clean, simple, and almost entirely wrong. In this version, same-sex desire was always forbidden, always hidden, always punished. Scholars who repeat this story are not lying exactly. They are simply ignoring roughly 800 years of poetry, philosophy, court records, and wine-soaked verse that tell a completely different story. Because between approximately 750 and 1258 CE, in the cities of Baghdad, Basra, Córdoba, and Cairo, something extraordinary happened, and most of it has been quietly shelved in the footnotes of Western scholarship ever since. By the end of this video, you will understand not just that same-sex love existed in the Islamic Golden Age, but that it was, in specific and documented ways, woven into the highest levels of its art, its science, and its political culture. Let us begin with the city itself. Baghdad in the year 800 CE was the largest city on Earth, home to somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people, more than Constantinople, more than Chang'an, more than anything Europe could offer at that moment. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur on a circular plan so geometrically perfect that Arab geographers called it Madinat al-Salam, the City of Peace. By the reign of Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809, the city had become a machine for producing knowledge. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was either being formally established or rapidly expanding during this period, gathering translators, astronomers, mathematicians, and physicians from across the known world. Greek texts arrived from Byzantium, Sanskrit manuscripts came from India, Persian astronomical tables were translated into Arabic. This was the context, a civilization in a state of explosive intellectual confidence, and that confidence extended, as we will see, into territory that later centuries would find deeply uncomfortable. The first body of evidence is the poetry. Not marginal poetry, not underground poetry, the most celebrated, widely copied, and publicly performed poetry of the age. The poet Abu Nuwas, full name Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn Hani al-Hakami, was born around 756 CE in Ahvaz, in what is now southwestern Iran. He was educated in Basra and Kufa, trained in the classical Arabic poetic tradition, and by the reign of Harun al-Rashid, he had become the most famous poet at the Abbasid court. His work was not whispered. It was recited at banquets, it was memorized by scholars, it was quoted by jurists, and a substantial portion of it was explicitly and unapologetically devoted to the love of young men. His collection, the Diwan, runs to hundreds of pages. In one poem, he writes of a boy whose face is like the moon over the rim of a wine cup. In another, he describes the physical beauty of a beardless youth with the same formal precision that classical Arabic poets used to describe the beloved desert landscape. These are not metaphors that scholars are stretching to interpret as homoerotic. They are direct. The manuscript tradition is clear, and Abu Nuwas was not punished for writing them. He was celebrated. But here is the detail that usually gets omitted from the comfortable summary. Abu Nuwas was not simply tolerated as an eccentric genius. He was personally close to the caliph's son, the future Caliph Al-Amin, who ruled from 809 to 813. The nature of that closeness is recorded in multiple contemporary sources, including the 10th century biographical dictionary, Kitab al-Aghani, the Book of Songs, compiled by Abu al-Faraj al-Isfahani. Al-Isfahani describes Al-Amin's well-documented preference for the company of young men, his fondness for dressing enslaved male attendants in women's clothing, and his relationship with a eunuch named Kauthar, whom he openly favored above his wives and concubines. This was not a secret. It was court gossip recorded in a major literary encyclopedia. The political crisis that eventually ended Al-Amin's reign had nothing to do with his personal life. It was a succession war with his brother Al-Mamun. The record is clear, and it does not look like the record of a society that treated same-sex desire as simply unthinkable. And this is still not the full picture. The second body of evidence comes from the literary genre known as the mujun, a term that translates roughly as licentiousness or libertine wit. Mujun poetry and prose was a recognized, named genre. It had practitioners, critics, and a readership. It was not pornography in the modern sense, of something produced in secret and consumed in shame. It was a form of sophisticated urban humor, and a significant portion of it dealt with same-sex encounters in explicit and comic terms. The 9th century writer al-Jahiz, Abu Uthman Amr ibn Bahr al-Jahiz, born around 776 in Basra, was one of the most respected intellectuals of the Abbasid period. He wrote on theology, zoology, rhetoric, and political theory. He also wrote a short text known as the Risala fi al-Jadiyya wa al-Hazl, and he is associated with a broader debate, recorded in several sources, about the relative merits of loving women versus loving boys. This debate, the Munazara, was a recognized literary form. It was not a secret underground pamphlet, it was a genre. Scholars including Everett Rowson and Jim Wafer, writing in the 1997 volume Homoeroticism in Classical Arabic Literature, have documented this tradition in detail, drawing on manuscript sources held in libraries from Cairo to Istanbul to the British Museum. The third body of evidence is harder to look at directly, because it concerns the institution of slavery. The Abbasid court maintained large numbers of enslaved people, both male and female, who were trained as entertainers, musicians, and companions. The ghulam, the term for a young male slave or attendant, appears constantly in the poetry and court literature of the period, in contexts that are unmistakably erotic. Historians including Matthew Gordon and Kathryn Babayan, in their 2016 edited volume Homoeroticism in Classical Arabic Literature, have argued that the ghulam figure occupied a specific social position that was neither fully masculine in the dominant sense nor feminine, a third category that the culture had, in practice if not in explicit theory, made room for. This does not mean the institution was benign. Enslaved people could not consent in any meaningful modern sense, and the power differential was absolute. But the point for our purposes is structural. A society that had made no room for same-sex desire would not have developed a named, aestheticized, extensively poeticized category of person specifically associated with that desire. The category existed because the desire was real, acknowledged, and in certain contexts, socially legible. Now we arrive at the turn. Because there is a version of this history that presents the Islamic Golden Age as simply and straightforwardly tolerant, and that version is also incomplete. The legal framework of classical Islamic jurisprudence did prohibit male same-sex intercourse, the act of liwat, under the category of the hudud, the fixed punishments derived from Quranic sources and hadith. All four major Sunni legal schools agreed on the prohibition, though they disagreed sharply on the evidentiary standard required for prosecution: 4 male witnesses to the act itself, a threshold so high that prosecution was, in practice, extraordinarily rare. What the legal texts prohibited and what the literary and social culture normalized existed in a tension that the period itself never fully resolved, and that later interpreters, both Muslim conservatives and Western orientalists, have each resolved in their own interested directions. The conservatives have emphasized the prohibition and treated the literary evidence as aberrant. The Orientalists of the 19th century often used the literary evidence to construct a fantasy of Oriental licentiousness that served their own colonial purposes. Neither reading is honest. The honest reading holds both things at once: a legal prohibition that was real, and a social and artistic culture that was also real, and a gap between them that was enormous. What happened to Abu Nuwas in the end tells part of this story. He was imprisoned at least once during the reign of al-Rashid, though the reasons given in the sources vary and include wine drinking as much as sexual conduct. He died around 814 CE, possibly in prison, possibly shortly after release, in his late 50s. His work survived, not in spite of the culture, but because of it. The Kitab al-Aghani preserves long sections of his poetry, including the erotic verse, because al-Isfahani understood him as a major figure in the Arabic literary tradition. The censorship came later. When European scholars began translating Arabic literature in the 19th century, they systematically omitted or bowdlerized the homoerotic content. Richard Burton's 1885 translation of 1001 Nights, scandalous by Victorian standards, was actually more complete than many academic translations that followed it. The German Orientalist Adam Mez, writing in 1922, acknowledged the homoerotic content of Abbasid court culture, but framed it as evidence of decadence and decline, a narrative that served the purposes of both European imperialism and later Islamic reformism, both of which needed the Golden Age to be something other than what the sources actually describe. The legacy of this suppression is still visible. In 2001, the scholar Khaled El-Rouayheb published Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World, 1500 to 1800, a rigorous study based on Ottoman and Arab manuscript sources that documented the persistence of the literary and social tradition of male same-sex love well into the early modern period, and documented the gradual hardening of attitudes that accompanied colonialism, nationalist reform movements, and the importation of European sexual categories into the Arab world in the 19th and 20th centuries. His argument, supported by the archival record, is that the concept of homosexuality as a fixed identity, as something a person is rather than something a person does, was not native to the classical Arabic tradition. What existed instead was a set of acts, aesthetics, and social roles that overlapped with what we now call same-sex desire, without mapping onto it exactly. That distinction matters because it means the suppression of this history is not simply a matter of hiding something that was always there in its modern form. It is a matter of flattening a more complex reality into a shape that serves contemporary political needs on all sides of the argument. What remains, when you set aside the distortions, is something genuinely remarkable, a civilization at the peak of its intellectual and artistic power produced, over several centuries, a body of literature in which same-sex love was a recognized subject, treated with the same formal craft, the same philosophical seriousness, and sometimes the same tenderness as any other form of human longing. Abu Nuwas was not a rebel writing against his culture. He was, in many ways, its finest instrument. The House of Wisdom translated Plato's Symposium into Arabic. Scholars debated the nature of love in terms that drew on both Greek philosophy and Islamic theology. The tension between law and practice was not a failure of the civilization. It was one of the places where the civilization did its most interesting thinking. If you have reached this point in the video, you already understand something that most general histories of the Islamic world will not tell you. The story of the Golden Age is not simpler for including this. It is more accurate. And accuracy, in the end, is the only thing that makes history worth the effort of recovering. There is more in these archives than any single video can hold. More poets, more court records, more suppressed translations, more arguments between jurists about what the law actually said and why. If that kind of history, the kind that survived despite every effort to lose it, is something you want to keep finding, then staying with this channel is the obvious next step.